We're talking today to Annie Zaleski. There's a new book out about one of my all-time favorite albums that is deserving of more introspection, and she's doing that as part of the 33 and a third book series, Duran Duran's Rio. At long last, getting some more pub. I mean, it's a well-regarded album, obviously. I was reading up one of your interviews that you did, that you've been pitching this album for a while now, and finally it got accepted.
That is right. We're almost 15 years. I started pitching this album to the series in 2007, and it was not taken. And I pitched it again in 2009, also not taken. And so I kind of put it to the side for, almost a decade. And then finally, I had the right calculus, the right proposal, and it worked.
What do you think made the organizers of this series decide now was the time to do it?
I think a combination of things. The series is published by Bloomsbury, which is an academic publisher, and it used to not be. It was distributed by someone else and printed by someone else. So I think there was a little bit of change in editorship. So I think that helped. I think I probably wrote a better proposal. I think I kind of had a better idea of how to be persuasive. So it was probably me just having a decade more of experience. I think also just Duran Duran is finally really, and I think a decade ago when I first started pitching it, they had really started having a resurgence with Red Carpet Massacre and working with Justin Timberlake and the Killers, talking them up. But I think now it's even become greater, like their regard. I think people are really, really starting to come around like, hey, Duran Duran's a really amazing band. It always has been. They're amazing musicians. They wrote amazing songs. Maybe in the 80s, if you thought that they were just some, MTV boy band, like I was really wrong. So right. I think that there's a lot more people who are saying, no, this is a really good band and it's time for them to get their due.
Okay, so your first exposure to the album, what was or any of the songs off that album? So and a two-part question. First exposure to anything from that, whether you liked it or you didn't, or didn't care one way or the other. And second, when did you really dive in personally to go, I love this album?
So I think, it's funny because I started getting in Duran Duran in the early 90s around the Wedding album. And I think it was probably around that time, so many radio stations had modern rock, like 80s retro shows and flashback shows. And I think VH1 played a lot of 80s videos. So I know I saw Rio and Hungry Like the Wolf at some point, and I heard them and Save a Prayer. And they were just kind of, they were such iconic songs. They were just really part of the fabric of everything going on. I got Rio out of the library. My town's library had Rio, and I taped it. And I still have the tape. I literally have it in like the other room. I'm going to share it on social media. Nice. And I love the, because, I was a kid, I didn't have money for, like a ton of albums. So I burned CDs from the library to tapes. So that was my first exposure and I loved it. Like that is one of the ones I remember as a teenager that I just absolutely love the record. And, and I got Decade, their greatest hits record too, and I actually, on the second side of the tape is all of these singles from Decade. So it's Rio, most of Rio on one side and the rest of it's like singles. I was always a huge Duran Duran fan as a kid. And so this is something that's been, at least 25 years now, probably over that.
Yeah, that was my first full Duran Duran album on cassette back in 1991, I think is when I got it on cassette when I started to dive into their music. Again, it was ironic considering that was pre-Wedding album, post Liberty, so they were kind of at one of their definite ebbs of their career. But that's when I dove in as well. That has always seemed to be the most complete, comprehensive album of theirs. Why do you think that album works so much better? And maybe I'm kind of leading with a question, but why does that album work so well compared to anything else in their oeuvre, even if it's fairly comparable or something that's far distant?
I think one reason is that it's just, when you listen to the songs, it's such a cohesive universe. I mean, every single song on the album is great. Every single song could have been a single. And, in every single song, it's a well-sequenced album. It's a very cohesive album. So first off, I think the songwriting everybody was just like really, together, and they were really just in a creative peak. So I think everyone also musically, I think, had really hit their stride. They had been together as a band for less than 2 years, and their first record, they were kind of trying to figure out how they all fit together, and where their influences kind of fit, and that they kind of gelled. They had also been on the road, and I think that helped a lot too. I mean, in 1981, the Duran Duran just toured. They hit the road and just really worked hard. And so when you're a working band and you're playing every night and you're playing together, you become really good really fast. So I think that's also, and they just, and a lot of also, I think, luck too. There's so many great bands that write these amazing singles, and it just doesn't, for whatever reason, it doesn't connect. And they had that magic alchemy, the stars aligned, as I've said in the book.
You've interviewed a lot of people for this book.
Yes.
It's nice and comprehensive. What was the most interesting interview of all the ones that you did?
That's a really good question. I'd interviewed John and Nick before over the years. And so, and I was, and so I had some familiarity. All of the band members, honestly, were super interesting. I interviewed everyone with Simon, and, their insights, they're such, I've said this elsewhere, but they are so good at analyzing Duran Duran, and they're also so good at analyzing the band's place in culture. That's really hard to do. They understand themselves, and they understand the band's place in culture. They were all great. Malcolm Garrett, who did the graphic design for the album sleeve, was also just amazing. He is a total genius. And, and he's done work for Buzzcocks and magazine, all sorts of art. And the way he kind of described, because he worked with Duran Duran for for their first 5 years, he did a ton of the graphic design. Just the way he described how everything kind of came together and what he did, just great. He really understood the band, and and so his insights were just invaluable, just so interesting too.
I'm looking forward to reading the part where you interview David Kerschenbaum, because that again, that was, for those of us in America, that's usually the first version we heard, whether it was in real time or those of us that discovered it in the 90s, and hearing those mixes and the punchiness. And then to later hear the original, you're like, there's something a little lacking, but that's because we were exposed to the Americanized version of that, of what Kerschenbaum did to remix it. How, from your interviews and with him and others, was there any takeaway of how critical those mixes were in selling the album and making the band sound a little bit more palatable to an American audience versus a British European audience?
What was so interesting in digging into that, and I talked to a lot of radio people too, to also kind of try to figure out that puzzle, because it's right. They, Duran Duran didn't hit at radio until there was a remix of Hungry Like the Wolf. What was so interesting is there was the Kerschenbaum remix. Then there was also the night version remix of Hungry Like the Wolf, which Colin Thurston did. And basically both versions got radio play. And so it was like a combination. It was like the double duty. It was like the cool, seductive dance floor version, and also David Kerschenbaum's version that does it. Kind of the keyboards are a little bit in the background. Simon's vocals are up in the mix. It's a little more, rock. And, you hear that on like the top 40 stations. So it was like a combination. And I think that's what was so interesting, is that, it took like multiple versions of the song, and I think now people are almost more familiar with the UK version. People, I think, almost forget that I don't think the Kerschenbaum mix is actually used on the radio now. I think it is the original mix.
In fact,
and so it's, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so that's what's so interesting, is that, and if you're not listening to it closely, it's like, it is very subtle. Like you really have to dig into and say, oh, that is a little bit of different, you really have to listen closely. It's so interesting.
Well, and in fact, the station, my station, Greatest Hits 98.1, we make a point of playing the original single mixes and radio edits of songs, which is a little bit more challenging because we got to search them out a bit more. It's like we're getting added degree of difficulty, but we're trying to recreate what you would have heard on the radio if you were alive at the time. So a couple of years ago, I dubbed in the Kerschenbaum mixes over the ones that you hear everywhere else. And it stands out, but you can also hear, like you listen to old American top 40s, same thing. You can tell like there's not the double tracking or there's a little something extra there, but it stands out more than the other ones. It jumps a bit more. And I can see why in America that would have made a bigger difference.
And especially because rock radio at that time, and the song hit at rock radio and then it crossed over to pop radio. rock radio was so different then. It was just starting to kind of embrace like, Men at Work and the Go-Go's, I guess the Go-Go's were a hit, but Men at Work and Dexy's Midnight Runners and Thomas Dolby, that they were just starting then. And so it was so rock oriented, Journey and Van Halen and Rush and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They needed it a little bit mixed to kind of just fit in a little bit more, because it's completely punchy, and you hear it, you're like, I can see why it hit on radio. Like you do hear it. It was such a brilliant remix.
What was your favorite discovery while researching the book? Once you actually started working on the book,
yeah,
what was your favorite discovery?
I think one of my favorite ones, and this is something that's been mentioned a couple times over the years, but in doing research, it really stood out to me. One of Simon's vocal influences on the record was Gordon Lightfoot. He had an early 70s hit that Simon really liked. And he mentioned in a VH1, like the songwriters did around 2000, that, that was an influence. And then I kind of did some Googling, and like you look at, I think it's even on their Wikipedia page, but I try not to use Wikipedia because things are wrong. But, he mentioned, on Duran Duran's website, fans had asked about this, but like, you can hear it, like you hear it in like the way he kind of sings. I'm like, that is so, I think that if someone mentions Duran Duran and 70s, light rock, never, it's like, they're like, total opposites, but you can hear it. His voice is he has such a theater background, and the way he kind of emotes, and like, you can hear that sentiment and emotion in that. So that was one of my favorite things that I learned, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. I'll have to listen. When I read the book, I'm going to start comparing and contrasting on that. How, if at all, did your perspective on the album change from, again, once you started working on the book, once that got sold, mm-hmm. to when you finished? Did your perspective change, and if so, how?
I've been a fan of it for so long, and I've listened to it for so long. I think my perspective, because I got to do so much deep listening, and then I was able to kind of listen with all the context from the interviews, I started to appreciate it a lot more. And, I always thought it was a genius record, but like, next level. Like I can hear now how everything fit together. I can hear the different influences a little stronger. I think, there was that, Simon was, Life, Love, Joy Division, and you can hear a little bit in that, which is, was also not something you might necessarily associate with Duran Duran, and then I can hear like the little details. You're listening on headphones, I can hear things a little bit clearer. I just, the record just seems like, it's just so much deeper to me. And even lyrically, I think it's such a record that I always loved and really resonated with, but then kind of reading the lyrics and trying to puzzle them out, like, it's a very sweet record. It's a very earnest, like, we are so excited to be doing this record. There's some moodiness and there's some, dreaming, like it's, it's a really lovely time capsule. I appreciate that a lot more now.
Yeah. And it's got peak Simon Le Bon esoteric, the aphids line. That's like the ultimate. If you're looking for, that's the one that I think all of us Duran Duran fans are longing for, something like that. And I'll see that in the message boards all the time. Will you do something like in The Chauffeur? Well, he ages. He's got different perspectives. You can't expect everything to be like when you were 24. It's understandable that it would change. How important do you think this album is in pop rock? Because I've always thought it's not a shame necessarily, but I'm surprised it's never made like the Rolling Stone 500, which I know that's subjective, but I've always thought that this is maybe the definitive album of the British invasion, of the early 80s British invasion, wave 2. And it's gotten a good amount of attention over the years, but it always seems to be maybe just lacking something, but yet no one really rips on it either. It's always considered a great album. So how would you rate its importance in pop rock?
It's funny you say that, because in my introduction, I compare it to kind of the 80s totemic records like Prince and Madonna and Bruce Springsteen. And because I said they're basically universe shifting records, because I completely agree with you. So many great bands of that era that you had amazing singles, and the records just didn't quite live up to it. They had like 3 good songs in them, and over full length record, it kind of peters out. Duran Duran didn't do that. They made this masterpiece. And I completely agree that I think that it is one of the most important records of the 80s, and one of the most important records very much of the British invasion. I mean, it kind of kicked off the British invasion. When you look at it, that came out in 82. It finally became a hit, later in the year into 83. 83 is when everything exploded, with Culture Club and Tears for Fears and Eurythmics. I mean, it really opened the door to a lot of things. I mean, I think it really is just, seminal. And I agree with you. It definitely deserves more press and just more accolades and respect, as this is a musical triumph and achievement.
Last main question for you. The band has referred a few times over their career to this album as kind of our next Rio in a way. I want to say I heard it referred to about Medazzaland. I think I heard it referred to about All You Need Is Now. That comes up every so often, yeah, which is understandable because Rio is the pinnacle. They're the band members. They're going to have their own opinions. As a fan and someone who's really investigated the music and really taken it all in, which other album do you think is the closest to being not Rio Part 2, but kind of getting to that point of a complete work that they can really say, here's Rio and here's this?
That's such a good question. I mean, you mentioned Medazzaland was like the record I fell in love with. Like, I absolutely adore that record. I saw them for the first time on that tour. I think that's probably one of their most underrated records in their catalog. It's just very strong as well from start to finish. And All You Need Is Now. I love that record. And that, I think, is the one where it's like, it's Rio Part 2. And I think they work with Mark Ronson, who's such a big Duran Duran fan. And he was like, just get back in that mindset. Get back in that mindset. I think both of those records, they have the essence and spirit of Rio. As much as, Duran Duran had all the success from album one, they just kept going. They weren't self-conscious and they just wrote and put out the music and remembered they were, why they were in a band in the first place. And I think both of, All You Need Is Now is specifically, I think, really kind of captures that. It's kind of cheeky. There's glamour. There's some, there's some, seduction. You can see a little bit of the parallels, but they never duplicated it. I mean, I think Rio is one of those records that comes along once in a band's career, and if they kept trying to, I think one of the strengths of Duran Duran is they didn't try to recapture it and really try to make Rio Part 2. They kept evolving. Today the band just shared a Soul Train performance of Skin Trade. That's just so funky and so cool. I mean, by the end of the 80s, they were really embracing their love of soul and R&B and funk, and they followed their muse wherever it went. And that's one of the reasons why Duran Duran is so great and remains so great. You never know where they're going to go next.
Exactly. Well, we've got this new album coming hopefully this year.
I'm excited.
I know. Well, supposedly the new single comes this month, and if anyone's watching this in like June, well, maybe it's already out and you already know what it sounds like, but there's a lot of anticipation. So more new to come. I would also encourage anyone to read your Twitter feed, especially the 33 Days of Rio. There's stuff in there that I'd never seen before, that again, as a fellow fan, that's saying something that, I never saw that performance, but that Philadelphia one was, even if it's just, I know it's just a lip sync, but still, it's different.
It really is. And, and I was sad that I didn't find that before my book was due. I knew it existed and I kind of looked around for it and it was kind of elusive. And so it surfaced like in the last couple months. And it's like this lip sync and Simon's dancing. And that I think was like summer of 82. This was before Rio was a big hit in America. And it's such a fascinating kind of look at the band and what they were like then, right before everything kind of exploded. Because there aren't enough videos of kind of that little bit in America, like they opened for Blondie, and I've been looking for like a video of their opening act on that tour because that's supposedly really good. I haven't found it yet, but it's like, like Simon is like, really kind of trying to figure out, and obviously they're in an empty studio lip syncing, which is such a bizarre experience anyway. So the fact that like he was like, so going for it, I mean, that speaks to how, what a consummate performer he is, but it definitely is like, they're willing to do anything. They were willing to really just give their all, even in most absurd situations, because they were so committed to being successful and making their band a success. And I mean, I think, that sums it up right there.
That's the reason why we're talking about a book about that album here we are 39 years later.
Yeah.
Annie, thank you for writing this book. I'm definitely going to be buying it. And I would encourage anyone watching, listening to buy it as well. Duran Duran's Rio from the 33 and a third series. Annie Zaleski, thank you so much. Enjoy book release day tomorrow after we're chatting. It's finally here. You got your books. It's here. Yay. So thank you for taking time to chat with me today, and all the best going forward.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Welcome. Take care. Bye-bye.